As if to prove his point, a young boy ran up to the chief, tugging on his sleeve. "Chief Richardson, come see what we made." The chief excused himself with a smile, following the child to where a group of kids had created an elaborate chalk drawing on the parking lot. A colorful map of their neighborhood where every house was connected by rainbow bridges. The sun set on Oak Hill, casting long shadows across the community center parking lot. But inside, the light of connection and understanding continued to shine. People lingered, helping to clean up, making plans for next month's gathering, exchanging phone numbers and recipes. As Linda locked up the community center that evening, she paused to look at the chalk drawing. 6 months ago, she had been afraid of change. Now, she was helping to create it. The neighborhood hadn't just transformed, its people had transformed. And in that transformation, they had found something beautiful, a true community where everyone belonged. 6 months had passed since that eventful moving day, and Oak Hill was a different place. The change wasn't visible in the well-kept lawns or the colonial houses, but in the way people interacted, in the new traditions that had taken root, and in the spirits of its residents. The community center, once quiet except for weekly meetings, now buzzed with activity almost every day. On this particular Sunday afternoon, families gathered for the monthly Tastes of Oak Hill potluck, a tradition that had started with a simple suggestion at that pivotal community meeting. "Try these," Mrs. Chen called out, offering a plate of homemade dumplings. "It's my grandmother's recipe." Next to her, Linda Whitfield was serving her famous sweet potato pie, chatting comfortably with a young couple who had just moved in last week. The sight would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. Chief Richardson moved through the crowd, stopping to chat with everyone. He'd made it a point to be visible in the community, not just as the police chief, but as a neighbor. Children ran up to high-five him. They knew him now as the man who coached weekend basketball at the park and always had time to hear about their day. "Remember when we used to just wave from our cars?" One resident said to another, watching the scene. "Now look at us, sharing meals, sharing stories. My kids are learning 3 different languages just from playing with their neighbors." The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken work, uncomfortable conversations, and a willingness to change. The Neighborhood Watch program, once focused on spotting suspicious activity, had been reorganized into a community outreach initiative. Instead of watching for trouble, they now watched out for opportunities to help. Linda had surprised everyone by becoming one of the most active volunteers. "It's funny," she told a newcomer as she refilled the lemonade pitcher. "I used to think I was protecting the neighborhood by keeping people out. Now I realize we make it safer by bringing people together." The monthly community meetings had evolved too. Gone were the complaints about property values and lawn height regulations. Instead, residents shared ideas for improvement, celebrated successes, and worked together to solve real problems. Last month, they had organized a neighborhood-wide effort to help an elderly resident repair his roof. At the local elementary school, teachers reported a change in their students. "They're more open," the principal told Chief Richardson during a recent visit. "They're curious about different cultures, different experiences. They're learning that diversity makes us stronger." Even the neighborhood's online group had transformed. Instead of a platform for complaints and suspicions, it had become a place to coordinate meal trains for sick neighbors, organize carpools, and share community success stories. The latest post was about a college scholarship fund they'd created for local students. The police department had noticed the change too. Officer Rodriguez, during her regular patrol, often found herself being invited to community events rather than being called to investigate suspicious activities. "It's like a different world," she told her partner. "Remember when we got that call about the chief on moving day? Who could have guessed it would lead to all this?" As the afternoon sun began to set, Chief Richardson stood up to address the gathered families. The crowd quieted naturally, not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine respect and affection. 6 months ago, he began, "I moved into this neighborhood not knowing what to expect. That first day, well, we all remember that first day." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd, including from Linda, who could now smile about it. "But look at us now. Look at what we've built together." He gestured to the diverse crowd before him. Families of all backgrounds sharing food and friendship, children playing together without a second thought about their differences, Elderly residents engaged in conversation with newcomers. This, he continued, is what community looks like. Not perfect, but perfectly human. We're still learning, still growing, but we're doing it together. And that makes all the difference. The discussion continued well past the scheduled end time. People lingered, talking in small groups, exchanging phone numbers, making plans. Someone suggested a monthly community dinner where families could share their cultures and stories. Another proposed a mentorship program connecting different generations. As the evening wound down, Linda approached Chief Richardson. "I'd like to help," she said. "I don't know how yet, but I want to be part of the change." He smiled, understanding the courage it took to say those words. Outside, the sun had set on Oak Hill, but inside the community center, something new was dawning. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a moment of transformation, where a neighborhood began to see itself not as it had been, but as it could be. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as residents filed in for the emergency meeting. Chairs scraped against the floor as people found their seats, the usual social groups noticeably mixed up tonight. Linda Whitfield sat in the back row, trying to make herself as small as possible, while Chief Richardson stood casually near the entrance, greeting everyone who walked in. "I haven't seen this many people at a community meeting in years," whispered one longtime resident to another. The room was packed, with people even standing along the walls. Parents had brought their teenagers, saying this was too important to miss. The local high school principal had canceled evening activities so families could attend. Richard Thompson, the neighborhood association president, stepped up to the microphone. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "We've called this meeting to discuss recent events that have brought to light some uncomfortable truths about our community," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. Before he could continue, Chief Richardson raised his hand. "If I may," he asked, walking toward the front. The room fell silent as he took the podium, still wearing casual clothes, a deliberate choice that didn't go unnoticed. "You know," he started, looking around the room with a warm smile, "when I was looking for a new home, I chose Oak Hill because I saw something special here. I saw well-maintained parks where children played together. I saw neighbors helping neighbors. I saw potential." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Yesterday's incident," he continued, "wasn't just about one person's actions. It was about the quiet assumptions we all carry, the stories we tell ourselves about who belongs where." His voice carried no judgment, only understanding. From her seat in the back, Linda found herself nodding. Earlier that day, she'd spent hours thinking about why she'd made that call. What had she really seen when she looked out her window? A man in casual clothes directing movers, or her own prejudices staring back at her? "I've been a police officer for 25 years, Richardson went on, "and I've learned that the best way to fight prejudice isn't through anger or shame, it's through understanding. So tonight, I'd like to share some stories with you, not as your police chief, but as your neighbor." For the next hour, he shared experiences from his career, times when assumptions had created barriers, and times when breaking down those barriers had built bridges instead. He talked about his first day as a rookie cop, when an elderly woman had refused his help, only to later become one of his strongest supporters. The room stayed silent, absorbed in his words. A teenager in the front row wiped away tears as Richardson described helping a young man who'd been profiled in a store, the same store where he'd later become a manager. Then something unexpected happened. Linda stood up. Her voice trembled but grew stronger as she spoke. "I need to say something," she began. "Yesterday, I made a terrible mistake. I looked out my window and saw what I expected to see, not what was actually there." People turned to look at her, but the eyes that met hers weren't filled with judgment. Instead, they reflected recognition of their own hidden biases, their own uncomfortable truths. "The hardest part wasn't being wrong," Linda continued. "It was realizing that I'd never questioned my assumptions before. How many times have I looked at someone and decided their story without knowing it?" Other hands began to raise. A business owner admitted he'd sometimes watched certain customers more closely than others. A teacher confessed to having different expectations for different students based on their backgrounds. Each confession opened the door for more honesty, more understanding. Chief Richardson listened to each person, occasionally adding his own insights. The meeting evolved into a genuine dialogue about bias, community, and change. When he finally spoke again, his words carried the weight of shared experience. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, "but it does happen. It happens in moments like this, when we're brave enough to be uncomfortable, when we're willing to learn from our mistakes instead of hiding from them." The community bulletin board outside the local library quickly filled with notices about upcoming diversity workshops and community outreach programs. Someone had pinned up a quote, "Change begins with understanding." Below it, a sign-up sheet for a new neighborhood welcome committee was already half full. As night fell over Oak Hill, lights flickered on in homes where families were having difficult but necessary conversations. Parents explained to their children why assumptions can be harmful. Couples discussed their own hidden biases. Teenagers texted their friends about standing up against prejudice. At 487 Oak Hill Drive, Chief Richardson sat in his partially unpacked living room, looking through old family photos. His father had faced similar situations decades ago. But maybe, he thought, watching more neighbors walk past his house than ever before, this time it's different. Maybe this time we're ready for real change. The moon rose over a neighborhood in transition. Tomorrow would bring the community meeting, but tonight, in homes across Oak Hill, people were already beginning to see their community and themselves in a different light. Sometimes it takes an uncomfortable moment to spark real change, and Oak Hill was about to discover just how transformative that change could be. News travels fast in small communities, and by sunset, the story of Linda Whitfield's 911 call had spread through Oak Hill like wildfire. At the local coffee shop, The Daily Grind, customers huddled over their lattes, discussing the morning's events in hushed tones. The barista had heard the story so many times she could recite it by heart. "Did you hear what happened at number 487? One elderly resident whispered to another over their chess game. "Linda called the police on our new neighbor, and it turned out to be the new police chief." His partner nearly knocked over a pawn in surprise, adding to the growing chorus of disbelief. The neighborhood's private social media group was buzzing with activity. Some residents expressed embarrassment, others anger, and a few defended Linda's actions as just being cautious. But the majority of posts reflected an uncomfortable realization: if Linda could mistake a police chief for a criminal based solely on his appearance, what other prejudices lurked beneath their community's polished surface? Mrs. Chen, walking her poodle for the second time that day, stopped to chat with every neighbor she met. "You know," she said to anyone who would listen, "when my family moved here 12 years ago, some people looked at us the same way. It's time for things to change." By late afternoon, Richard Thompson, the head of the neighborhood association, called an emergency meeting for the following evening. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the incident. "No, we can't ignore this," he told one concerned resident. "This is exactly what we need to talk about." The local elementary school principal, who lived just around the corner, used the incident as a teaching moment. During afternoon assembly, without naming names, she spoke to the children about making assumptions about people based on their appearance. Sometimes, she explained, the person you're quick to judge might be someone amazing, like a doctor, a teacher, or even a police chief. At the community center, the yoga class turned into an impromptu discussion group. "I've lived here for 20 years, one woman said as she rolled up her mat, "and I never realized how comfortable we'd become with our own biases. Maybe this is the wake-up call we needed." The impact rippled beyond Oak Hill's borders. Officers Rodriguez and Chen shared the story at the police station, where it sparked serious discussions about community relations. The chief's handling of the situation had set a powerful example of leadership and grace under pressure. By evening, local reporters had caught wind of the story. They gathered outside the neighborhood entrance, hoping to catch interviews with residents. But Oak Hill's community showed its first sign of positive change by closing ranks, not to hide the incident, but to handle it themselves as a community should. Linda Whitfield hadn't left her house since her coffee with Chief Richardson. Through her window, she could see neighbors walking past, some pointing discreetly at her house. The shame she felt was overwhelming, but something else was growing alongside it, a determination to make things right. Her phone buzzed with messages from her social circle, some supportive, others critical. Her closest friend texted, "Maybe we all need to think about why we react the way we do." Linda stared at those words for a long time, letting their truth sink in. At the grocery store, the usual evening shoppers found themselves in deep conversations in the aisles. You know, one man said while selecting tomatoes, "My kids play at the park with children of all backgrounds. They don't see what we see. Maybe they're the ones who've got it right." Richardson smiled, gesturing toward his front door. "Well, what better way to get to know your neighbors? Besides," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "as the neighborhood watch coordinator, you should probably know what your new police chief looks like, even in casual clothes." Officer Rodriguez and Chen shared another look, both impressed by their chief's handling of the situation. This was leadership in action, turning a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for understanding. As Linda hesitantly followed Richardson into his house, the moving crew resumed their work, and the officers headed back to their patrol car. The morning sun continued its climb in the sky, shining down on a neighborhood where a small but significant change had just begun. Inside the house, among half-unpacked boxes and randomly placed furniture, two neighbors sat down to have a conversation that would change not just their relationship, but the entire community. Sometimes, the biggest revelations come not from dramatic confrontations, but from simple moments of human connection over a cup of coffee. Officers Rodriguez and Chen exchanged knowing looks before heading towards Linda Whitfield's house. The walk down those three houses felt longer than usual, each step heavy with purpose. The perfectly manicured lawns and cheerful garden gnomes seemed to watch their approach, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez called out, her voice professional but firm, "would you mind coming with us to address your concerns about the suspicious activity?" Linda had been peeking through her curtains, and at the officer's call, she emerged onto her porch like a queen preparing to address her subjects. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," Linda said, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her floral dress rustled as she hurried down her porch steps. "I just knew something wasn't right about this situation. I've lived here for 15 years, and we've never had anything like this before." As they walked back toward Richardson's house, Linda filled the air with justifications. "You see, we have a certain standard in Oak Hill. We need to know who's moving in. What if they're not, the right sort of people?" Her voice dropped to a whisper on those last words, not realizing she was digging herself deeper with every syllable. The bright morning sun seemed to spotlight their approach to the house. The moving crew had resumed their work, but their eyes followed the small procession. Chief Richardson was helping unload a box from the truck when he saw them coming. He set down the box and turned to face them, his posture relaxed but commanding. "Mrs. Whitfield, I presume," he said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "I'm Thomas Richardson, your new neighbor." He paused for effect before adding, "and the new chief of police. I was hoping to meet my neighbors under better circumstances, but sometimes life has other plans." The color drained from Linda's face so quickly that Officer Chen instinctively took a step closer, worried she might faint. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The phone she had been clutching slipped from her fingers and clattered on the driveway. But you," Linda stammered, looking frantically between the officers and Richardson. The realization of what she had done, calling the police on her new police chief, hit her like a tidal wave. "But you were in regular clothes," she finally managed to say, as if that somehow explained everything. "Yes," Richardson replied kindly, "most people wear comfortable clothes when they're moving. Even police chiefs." His voice carried no anger, no accusation, just a gentle reminder of how assumptions can lead us astray. A moving truck rumbled past on the street, the noise seeming to snap Linda out of her shocked state. I didn't know," she whispered, her face now flushed with embarrassment. I assumed." "That's exactly the point, Mrs. Whitfield," Richardson said, his voice carrying the weight of years of similar experiences. "We often think we know what we're seeing, but our assumptions can blind us to the truth right in front of us." The movers had stopped working again, watching the scene unfold. One of them, an older man with gray hair, nodded approvingly at the chief's words. Even Mrs. Chen's poodle had stopped barking, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. "I should go," Linda said quickly, turning to flee, but Richardson's voice stopped her. "Actually, Mrs. Whitfield, I was about to take a break. Would you like to join me for some coffee? I just unpacked my coffee maker, and I make a pretty decent brew. We could talk about your concerns about the neighborhood." His invitation hung in the air like a peace offering. Linda turned back slowly, her eyes wide with surprise. This wasn't how she had expected this confrontation to go. Where was the anger? The accusations? The threats of consequences? You want to have coffee with me?" she asked incredulously. "After what I just did." Officer Rodriguez couldn't help but notice how the chief had handled the situation. No anger, no confrontation, just a calm demonstration of the absurdity of the assumptions made about him. It was a masterclass in professional behavior that she would remember throughout her career. "Well, sir," Rodriguez said, playing along, "everything appears to be in order here. Would you like us to inform the caller about their mistake?" She chose her words carefully, aware that this moment would be talked about in the department for years to come. Richardson looked thoughtfully at Linda's house, then back at his officers. "No need for that," he said, his voice carrying wisdom earned from years of similar experiences. "I have a feeling there will be plenty of time for introductions at the next community meeting. Sometimes the best response to prejudice is simply proving it wrong, day after day." The movers had paused again, watching the interaction with growing respect. One of them gave a low whistle of appreciation at the chief's handling of the situation. Even the neighbors who were still pretending not to watch seemed impressed by his composure. As the officers prepared to leave, Richardson called out, "Oh, and officers? I'll see you both tomorrow at the station. First order of business will be discussing community outreach programs." His smile carried a message that both officers understood perfectly. This incident would become a teaching moment, not a source of division. The police cruisers pulled away, leaving behind a neighborhood forever changed by a simple moving day incident. The air was thick with unspoken lessons about assumptions, prejudice, and the power of responding to ignorance with grace. As Richardson returned to his moving boxes, he knew that his work in this community had already begun, though not quite in the way he had expected. Two police cruisers pulled up smoothly to the curb outside 487 Oak Hill Drive. Officer Maria Rodriguez stepped out of the first car, immediately recognizing the suspicious person from the dispatch call. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth as she spotted Chief Richardson helping the movers with a heavy box. Her partner, Officer David Chen, exited the passenger side, trying hard to keep a straight face. "Can you believe this?" Rodriguez whispered to Chen as they walked up the driveway. "First day in the neighborhood, and someone's already called the cops on the chief." Chen shook his head, his expression a mixture of amusement and disappointment. They'd both attended the department meeting last week where Richardson had been introduced as their new chief. The morning sun was getting stronger now, and the street was coming alive with curious neighbors. Some pretended to water their lawns, while others slowly walked their dogs past the house, all trying to get a glimpse of the unfolding scene. The moving truck crew had paused their work, watching uncertainly as the officers approached. Chief Richardson set down the box he was carrying and walked toward his officers, wiping his hands on his jeans. His face showed no anger, no frustration, just a calm understanding that came from years of dealing with similar situations. "Officers," he greeted them warmly, loud enough for the watching neighbors to hear. "I wasn't expecting to see you until tomorrow at the station." Officer Rodriguez glanced toward the house 3 doors down, where Linda Whitfield was still standing on her porch, phone clutched to her chest. "Sorry to interrupt your moving day, Chief," Rodriguez said, matching his professional tone. "We received a call about suspicious activity at this address." The movers had resumed their work, but they moved more slowly now, clearly listening to every word. One of them, a young man with a red cap, shook his head in disbelief as he carried a lamp inside. The chief's response would stick with him for years to come. "Well, officers," Richardson said, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearest neighbors to hear, "I suppose my choice of moving day attire wasn't up to neighborhood standards." He gestured to his worn jeans and t-shirt with a smile that held no bitterness. "Should I have worn my uniform to unpack boxes?" Several neighbors who had been pretending not to watch suddenly found themselves chuckling. Mrs. Chen, still walking her poodle, had stopped to observe the scene. She shot a disapproving look toward Linda's house before continuing her walk. Officer Chen pulled out his notepad, playing along with the chief's approach. "Sir, we received a report about someone suspicious directing a moving operation. Would you care to explain what's happening here?" His eyes twinkled as he asked the question, loud enough for everyone to hear. Richardson straightened up, assuming an official pose despite his casual clothes. "Well, Officer Chen, what you're witnessing is the new chief of police moving into his home. The suspicious activity would be me checking off items on my moving list and directing these hard-working gentlemen where to put my furniture. Would you like to see my badge?" The sound of a door quickly closing echoed down the street. Linda Whitfield had finally retreated inside her house. The neighbors who had gathered started dispersing, many of them shaking their heads and whispering among themselves. Mrs. Linda Whitfield had lived in Oak Hill for 15 years, and she prided herself on knowing everything that happened in her neighborhood. From behind her lace curtains, she watched the scene unfolding at number 487 with growing concern. The moving trucks had arrived early that morning, and she hadn't received any notice about new neighbors moving in. In her mind, that was the first red flag. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against the windowsill as she observed the black man in casual clothes directing the movers. He didn't look like he belonged in their neighborhood, at least not according to her narrow world view. The fact that he was well-dressed and organized didn't register in her mind. She only saw what she wanted to see. "Helen, you won't believe what's happening right now," she whispered urgently into her phone, calling her friend who lived 2 streets over. "There's this man, and he's got moving trucks, but something doesn't feel right. Why wouldn't the real estate agent tell us about new neighbors?" Helen's voice crackled through the phone, suggesting that maybe she should go introduce herself, but Linda wasn't hearing it. Her mind was already racing with assumptions, each one more outlandish than the last. The designer handbags being carried into the house must be stolen. The careful way the man checked his clipboard, obviously casing other houses in the neighborhood. Linda paced her front porch, her flowered dress swishing as she moved back and forth. Her heart raced as she convinced herself that she was witnessing a crime in progress. "I'm telling you, Helen, this isn't right. I'm going to call the police. Better safe than sorry." Her fingers trembled slightly as she hung up with Helen and dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice answered, and Linda launched into her report, her voice dripping with false concern. "Yes, hello, I need to report suspicious activity in Oak Hill. There's a black man directing what looks like a moving operation, but I know the owners of that house moved out last month, and nobody told us about new neighbors." The dispatcher asked for more details, and Linda provided them with what she thought was helpful information. "He's wearing regular clothes, not what you'd expect from someone moving into this neighborhood. He keeps looking around and writing things down. I've lived here for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this." What Linda didn't realize was that her call had just set in motion a chain of events that would shake her comfortable world to its core. As she waited for the police to arrive, she texted several neighbors in their community group chat, called the police about suspicious activity at 487. Everyone stayed alert. From her vantage point, she watched as more boxes were brought into the house. The man was now helping the movers with some of the heavier items, his sleeves rolled up, revealing well-defined arms that spoke of regular gym visits. But Linda didn't see a hard-working professional moving into his new home. Her prejudices had already written a very different story. She noticed Mrs. Chen from next door walking her poodle, slowing down to observe the moving activity. Linda quickly texted her, "Don't get too close. Police are on their way." Mrs. Chen gave her a strange look and continued walking, choosing to smile and wave at the new neighbor instead. Linda's hands shook as she poured herself a glass of water in her kitchen, keeping one eye on the street through her window. She had always seen herself as a protector of the neighborhood, the one who kept things in order. The irony of her actions, that she was the one disturbing the peace, was completely lost on her. The sound of approaching sirens made her heart leap. Finally, she thought, hurrying back to her porch. But as she would soon learn, those sirens weren't bringing the resolution she expected. Instead, they were bringing a powerful lesson about prejudice, assumption, and the cost of judging books by their covers. In her mind, she was already rehearsing how she would tell the story at the next neighborhood watch meeting. She imagined herself as the hero who prevented a crime. Little did she know, she was about to become the cautionary tale in a very different kind of story, one about learning, growth, and the importance of looking beyond our biases. As the police cars pulled up to the curb, Linda straightened her dress and prepared to greet them with all the self-importance of someone who thought they were doing their civic duty. The next few minutes would change everything she thought she knew about her role in the community, her neighbors, and herself. On a bright spring morning in the peaceful Oak Hill neighborhood, where pristine lawns stretched before colonial-style homes, Thomas Richardson stood in his driveway, watching as moving trucks pulled up to his new house. The gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming cherry blossoms, and birds chirped their morning songs, creating a perfect backdrop for what should have been an exciting new chapter in his life. Thomas, dressed in comfortable blue jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that had seen better days, wiped sweat from his forehead as he checked items off his clipboard. 25 years in law enforcement had taught him to stay organized, even during life's chaotic moments like moving day. His new position as police chief was a dream come true, the result of decades of hard work, countless sleepless nights, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The movers, a team of 4, worked efficiently, carrying boxes and furniture from the truck to the house. Thomas couldn't help but smile as he watched his leather recliner, his favorite piece of furniture, being carefully maneuvered through the front door. That chair had been with him through countless football games and late-night case reviews. "Careful with that corner table," he called out, pointing to an antique piece his grandmother had left him. "It's been in the family for 3 generations." The movers nodded, treating the piece with extra care. Thomas had learned the value of kindness from his grandmother, who always said that how you treat people matters more than any title you might hold. As the morning progressed, neighbors walked by with their dogs or on their way to collect their mail. Some offered curious glances but quickly looked away when Thomas tried to make eye contact. He was used to it. These small moments of discomfort that had followed him throughout his career. But he didn't let it bother him. Experience had taught him that actions speak louder than prejudices. Inside the house, Thomas began unpacking boxes in his home office. He carefully placed his awards and certificates on the desk, not out of pride, but as reminders of the challenges he'd overcome. There was his first commendation for bravery after saving a family from a house fire, his certificate from the FBI Academy, and the Community Service Award he'd received for starting a youth mentoring program. The sound of children playing reached him through the open window, and he paused to listen. This was exactly why he'd chosen this neighborhood. It was alive with families and had excellent schools. He'd done his research, spent months looking for the perfect place to settle down, somewhere he could make a real difference, both as a resident and as the new chief of police. Thomas was arranging books on his shelf when he noticed movement through his window. A woman in a floral dress was standing on her porch 3 houses down, phone pressed to her ear, staring intently at his house. Her body language spoke volumes, the way she partially hid behind a column, how she kept glancing around nervously. He'd seen that behavior countless times in his career, and his instincts told him this peaceful moving day was about to become more interesting. He sighed, checking his watch. It was only 10:30 a.m., and he wasn't due at the station until tomorrow. Part of him had hoped the neighborhood would be different, that his credentials and position would speak for themselves. But old habits die hard, and he knew better than most that change takes time and patience. What Thomas didn't know yet was that this ordinary moving day was about to become an extraordinary lesson for the entire community. As he continued unpacking his boxes, organizing his new home with the same precision he applied to his police work, events were already in motion that would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone in Oak Hill. The woman was still on her phone, now pacing back and forth on her porch. Thomas couldn't help but chuckle to himself. If she only knew who she was calling about. He'd faced similar situations before, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't just another police officer, he was the chief. And sometimes, the best lessons come wrapped in unexpected packages.